Welcome to the program this evening. I'm Duncan of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome you today to the conversation with Gal Beckerman with Dr. Bonnie Ellinger on his new book, The Quiet Before, on the Unexpected Origins of Radical Ideas. We thank all of you who have donated to make these programs possible, and I'd like to recognize Marcia Torabin, who has generously underwritten today's program. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bonnie Ellinger, former faculty member at Bar-Ilan University, who will introduce our invited guest. Dr. Ellinger.
Thank you, Ron. Good evening, everyone. Before we get to tonight's program, I would like to say a few words about our distinguished lecture series director, who always introduces everyone else, but is never introduced himself. So here we go. Duncan Hart, PhD, is a cultural anthropologist from Indiana University with postdoctoral work at the University of Oxford. He's the director of the Institute for Tolerance Studies and a former university vice president and dean of academic affairs. He has awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and Fulbright, among others. Hart has written books on crypto-Jews, Jews in the Arab world, and Sephardic Jews. He has been an invited lecturer on Jewish life and culture for the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, the Haberman Institute, Tulane University, and the National Labor Relations Board, among other venues. He's a former president of the Jewish Federation of New Mexico. Very impressive, I would say. And now
Thank you, Bonnie.
Sure, Ron. And now to our invited speaker. Gal Beckerman is the senior editor for books at The Atlantic. Formerly an editor at the New York Times Book Review, he is the author of the widely acclaimed When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone, which won the National Jewish Book Award and the Sammy Rohr Prize and was named a Best Book of the Year by the New Yorker and the Washington Post. He has a PhD in media studies from Columbia University and writes for many publications, including the New Republic and the Wall Street Journal. His new book, The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of radical ideas, is called, quote, a brilliant book, insightful analysis, and colorful storytelling, end quote, by Walter Isaacson. It is my pleasure to welcome Gal Beckerman to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. Glad to have you with us here, Gal.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be in Santa Fe, if only virtually.
Maybe we'll get you one day.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that.
You have a standing invitation. So I understand that around the time you were writing When They Come For Us, We Will Be Gone, at the fight for Soviet Jewry, you started thinking about the ideas that you present in The Quiet Before. Can you tell us how this developed?
Sure. So that book was a really sort of epic undertaking. I wanted to tell the whole story of the Soviet Jewry movement, a movement that started in the 1960s and sort of had its culmination at the end of the 80s when many, almost 1.5 million Soviet Jews were finally able to immigrate out of the Soviet Union. And along the course of my research, I really had to understand and get to know the dissident communities inside the Soviet Union, those people who were fighting against the regime for one reason or another, either for their religious liberties or, like the Jews, just for the chance to actually be able to get out. And the thing that really begun to fascinate me, and I think it's what you're referring to, is that they all had this mode of communication amongst themselves called samizdat. Samizdat was underground writing. Samizdat in Russian literally means self-published. This was writing that could not be, it was not approved by the state, and the state had to approve all anything that was published had to be published officially. So these were things that, either books from the West that were not allowed in the Soviet Union that people would reproduce themselves. In my Soviet Jewry book, the big book like this was Leon Uris's Exodus. Some of you might remember that book. It circulated in samizdat form among the community of Jewish dissidents. But there was another form of samizdat that was even more interesting for me, which was people would kind of collect what they found to be evidence of civil rights violations, human rights violations, ways that their freedoms were being abrogated inside the Soviet Union. And they would write those down and create almost like these journals. There was one very famous one called the Chronicle of Current Events, which was essentially a pastiche of all kinds of things that people had witnessed. The government didn't care about these things, but for the people who were putting this journal together, this was a chance to sort of bear witness, to say, these are the ways that we're being subjugated in this country. And slowly the network of people that contributed to this journal grew and grew, and it became this it played this very important role for the dissidents. It was, in a way, sort of the glue that held them together as a community. And by being part of it, by contributing to it, you sort of, expressed your solidarity, your commitment to this other idea, to this other set of ideals, to ideals of a democratic society, of a more free society. And I became very fascinated with the role that the medium itself played, that samizdat played for them, how useful it was, how effective it was. And I was having these thoughts just at the moment in around 2010, 2011, where everyone was getting very excited about social media. And as being a similarly sort of revolutionary medium, a medium that if in the hands of dissidents could, take down regimes and build new realities, right? But I also began to see the limitations of social media. They might be good in sort of creating a protest, and they were quite effective at that, but they weren't good at doing this thing that samizdat did, which was over time, over a long period of time, build the foundations of kind of an alternate way of thinking, an alternate way of being, and alternate forms of self-government. So these two kind of contrasting ideas, the excitement I had about samizdat and the disappointment that I had, that a lot of us had about social media, started me thinking about the role that communication plays in building a social movement and in bringing new ideas, radical new ideas into the world, which is what social movements do.
And you have a perfect combination in the book of things like samizdat contrasted with today's social media, and hopefully with the questions that we have, the audience will be able to see how successfully you do that. So my next question, Gal, is throughout The Quiet Before, you write about the incubation of new ideas, and you refer to Saul Alinsky.
Mm-hmm.
Who was he? What were his rules for radicals? And how were they manifested in the issues presented in The Quiet Before?
So Saul Alinsky was a community organizer. I think that's what he called himself, who was functioning around the 60s, 70s most prominently. He wrote a book that's been kind of widely cited by activists and other community organizers called Rules for Radicals. And Saul Alinsky was sort of, an old school organizer, activist. He progressive, leftist, you could even say. He knew how to sort of get unions started, how to get people in local communities activated around issues that they wanted to, make change on. But I found Alinsky particularly interesting for my purposes because he was diagnosing, what he saw some of the problems with social movements and sort of activist culture in the 60s and 70s. And he broke it down in a way with a metaphor that I found very useful for me, which is he said that, in his experience, successful revolutions have to follow the 3-act structure of a play. right? So what's the 3-act structure of a play? In the first act, you sort of meet the protagonist and the antagonist. The lines are drawn. In the second act, the tension between them begins to grow, and each side begins to define itself and its objectives. And really only in the last act do those two forces sort of come into conflict and towards some kind of resolution, right? And then you have the curtain comes down at the end of the play. And what he was saying was that what he often experienced was that, even this is even before social media, when protests in the 60s came to take on sort of an outsized role in activist circles, that he was seeing people fast forward, jump too quickly to that third act, right? They wanted the resolution. They wanted good to defeat evil, and for that to be the extent of the energy that they were going to put into their movements. And what he was saying was that if you skip those first two acts, the acts where you establish yourself, where you figure out your objectives, when you develop your organizational structure, when you even figure out how you're going to align the various interests that often come together when you have a movement or when you have a new radical idea. Cohere, have a place for debate, have what I call in the book, as you mentioned, incubation, this period of time where you need to sort of bake, right, as an idea. When you don't do that, when you're able to just go right to the streets, he was saying, you have this wonderful moment, everyone feels emotionally very good about it, but then things just completely deflate and crash. And the promise that has been held out by a particular movement of the things that can be changed, the concrete things that can be changed, they never really get fulfilled in the same way, because that foundation, those first two acts haven't, when they're not there, then certain fundamental things that need to exist for change to occur just don't happen.
Yes, yes. And we do see that throughout the book, how certain things do develop, certain revolutions happen, and others, as you say, just kind of dissipate. Right. So there are early chapters in the book that relate how letter writing, petitioning, and debating were utilized in places as far-flung as Aix-en-Provence, Manchester, and Accra, the forerunner of Ghana, to bring about social change. Can you explain what transpired in Manchester in 1839?
Sure. I like this chapter. I mean, first I should say, just to sort of elaborate a bit, is that each of those, so the book is composed of kind of roughly two halves, and the first half are these historical, I don't like to call them case studies because that sounds a little academic. They're stories. They're really essentially stories. And in each story, you have a medium that's playing an important role, a form of communication that's actually doing that sort of binding that I talked about Samizdat doing. And it's adding, and as we read the chapters, we add to our awareness of kind of what forms of communication are really useful, what they provide a movement. So that chapter is about the 1830s. To set the scene a bit, you have England, where there is this sort of ideal of a democratic society, going back to the Magna Carta, but in reality, only a very, very small number of men actually have the vote. And at the same time, you have industrialization that's picking up and making people's lives, working people's lives, quite miserable. The conditions are pretty awful, but yet they have no recourse. They have no representation, zero representation, because these people don't own property. They don't fulfill the minimum requirement for actually having the right to vote. So how do they exercise any sort of power? How do they gain representation? Well, they figure that there is this tiny loophole in English law going back a few hundred years that allows any British citizen to petition the Parliament and the King to petition them on any issue they want, to deliver a petition. Normally, these were used for like land disputes, very small scale things. But an idea emerges and it's carried forward by an Irish politician named Fergus O'Connor, who's the center of that chapter, this very sort of fiery, engaging, charismatic orator. And the idea is let's deliver a petition, but let's make it what they called a monster petition. Let's make this a petition where we get working people all over the country to sign on to the idea that they should be given the right to vote. And this becomes this enormous campaign. It's called the Chartist movement because the idea of a national charter was these few points that they were asking for, and the most important of them being the right to vote. And so the Chartist movement kind of spins out from this act of petition signing, right? And it's not petition signing as we think of it today, where you click something online. This is going door to door, sneaking onto factory floors. They have to actually create the pages themselves with creating lines on the pages and setting up in marketplaces and work really hard to get people to sign. And then each act of signing is this sort of intimate moment of convincing somebody to basically join a constituency, to say, I am part of a working class that should have the right to vote. So there's often a conversation, maybe an argument that ends in the best circumstance with somebody signing on. So this is it's a process around the petition, but the petition as a medium, that chapter is called Coherence, because what it does is it allows a lot of people at that time had a great deal of disgruntlement, unhappiness about their state of their existence. But these were emotions. They needed to cohere into a movement that could ask for one thing, the right to vote. And so the petition was a way to literally get them all on the same page, right? So that chapter is about sort of what spun out from the petition, the movement that it allowed it to create. Now, as in many of these examples, that first petition, which gathered 1.3 million signatures, which was
hard to believe,
unbelievable at the time, it got laughed out of Parliament. They showed up, they delivered it, and they literally got the parliamentary record. It was funny to find it. Actually shows that there was just like guffaws, in the galleries. They just laughed them out the door. They wouldn't even the vote to debate the petition was voted down. So they wouldn't even allow them really a chance to make their case. But it was an extremely important moment, because out of that process, and a lot of these chapters are about process, out of that process developed a self-awareness among this group of people that we have rights, and that we are a group, that we are a working class. So it was incredibly important. There were 2 more petitions. Eventually, people did get the right to vote. But I wanted to look at this sort of inception moment, this first moment when people began to sort of conceive of themselves in this way.
Well, that's interesting, because as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the dissidents who were using samizdat.
Mm-hmm.
Now the use of the petition in Manchester to get the right to vote. And these are both very positive, right? The dissidents have their onion skin paper,
right.
Where the typewriter is the typewriter can be traced by the government. I mean, it was very much underground how things were done, but it was successful and it was wonderful. Yeah. And the same thing with the petitioning. Now, however, it's very disconcerting that we can characterize Charlottesville as a successful act of defiance. So what I would love if you could do is to compare Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011 with Charlottesville in 2017.
Yeah.
In other words, the Arab Spring with Charlottesville.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Egyptian attempt at change fail, where Charlottesville, unfortunately, did not?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I want to say that, my idea of what radical means, the radical that's in the subtitle of this book, um, it's not necessarily radical in the sort of the way we think about radical as being like a product of leftism, or always on the left. Radical to me means just you have an idea that's counter to the status quo, that is, wants to sort of dismantle part of our reality that is we've taken completely for granted, as just being as natural as the air we breathe. And in order to do that, that could be slavery, uh, or it could be, that we live in a multi-ethnic society, right? The challenge to those ideas are both radical when they first emerge, right? So that's, I guess, in terms of definition, sort of why both of those things can fall under the umbrella of what I'm talking about here. But to go to your question, which is a great question because it involves two chapters I have in the book. Tahrir Square, to me, is the sort of ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when you rely too much on social media as your medium to make change. Because what happened in Tahrir Square? You had a group of people who found each other on Facebook, that discovered that they all had the same sorts of disgruntlements. And that led to them doing what social media is very good at, which is calling everybody out to the square, right? Social media is an incredible bullhorn. It allows for speed and scale as we've never experienced before in human history. So social media was an incredible bullhorn for these activists. It allowed them to get everybody to the square very quickly, and at huge numbers, and it had the effect that they wanted. They managed to eventually bring down Hosni Mubarak. They brought down the dictator, right? So at first blush, you would think, what a great medium that these people had. But the question that I ask in that chapter that carries it forward beyond that day when the dictator steps down is, what happened next? And what happened next is that group of people needed to build themselves into a political opposition. But if they were going to contend for power, they needed to have a space where they could figure out their differences, because this was an odd coalition that came together in Tahrir Square. There were like Islamists, there were Marxists, there were, they were all focused on the singular, when it was the singular goal of taking down Mubarak, that's easy, right? Easy in the sense that, you don't have differences of opinion on that particular point. But as soon as that day is over, the next day where it's, what is our society going to look like? How democratic will it be? What role will religion have? What kind of presidency do we imagine? How much power will it embody? They needed a place where they could work out all those ideas and figure out who they were as an opposition. It was, in the best of circumstances, going to be difficult because they were contending with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was an organization that had plenty of time to incubate, along the lines that I describe in the book, because they'd been basically an underground group for 30 years with a defined, kind of cellular structure, and they knew if they ever got power exactly what they wanted to accomplish. And then you have the army, which was not easily going to give up power, even though they had lost Mubarak as a kind of figure. So there were always going to be difficulties for this group to actually figure out how to contend for power. But what made it so hard, so much harder, almost impossible, is that they took to Facebook again. They took to social media, and social media, just like, they started tearing each other down. And what is the incentive structure of social media? That's the words we often use to describe it. What does social media want? Social media wants you to be loud and attention grabbing, and to not focus too deeply on one thing. You always have to say something that's going to turn everybody's attention in your way. It's not a place to hash out ideas. It's not a place to take risks, to say, hey, maybe we should try this or that. So it totally, and this is not me saying this is the activists themselves saying that it completely worked against them. It was totally counterproductive. Some of the people that emerged from Tahrir Square, who were the biggest champions of social media became its biggest critics for this precise reason, because they saw how it just kind of made them, they ended up tearing each other down. So that's one example. And then you have Charlottesville. I don't need to tell you, disgusting group of white supremacists who decide that they want to be taken seriously. They want to unite all their various strands and be taken seriously, and actually maybe let other white people in America see that, oh, maybe you share our point of view. That's their objective in Charlottesville. It's respectability, right? So they needed a space where they could also work out their differences. I mean, we think of white supremacists as being this kind of uniform group of people, but there's people who more or less hate Jews. There's people who are like, no, I'm serious. I mean, I should say, for this chapter, I spent a few pretty awful weeks reading. I got my hands on tens of thousands of chats from this closed chat room where they were communicating. And I was shocked at the way they talked to each other, as you can probably imagine. A lot of it was just sort of hard to listen to, but, they did have these differences of opinion, and they needed to work them out if they were going to have an effective showing, right? So where did they do this? They did not do it on social media because, I mean, first of all, most of them were banned from social media. So they turned what was a necessity into a virtue, which is that they found for themselves a small, closed, private chat room on a platform called Discord, which I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it was invented basically for gamers, for people who are like, killing zombies and stuff. But they also want a space where they can talk while they're doing it. So you're able on Discord to, and this is where we get into the nitty gritty of like what a medium provides. So Discord gives you a chance to create what's called a server, which is your own private room. You can decide who enters the room. Each room has a moderator. Each server has a moderator, and these are spaces that privilege conversation. And what I mean by that is there's no like button, there's no favorite, there's no, when you have a like button or a favorite, as I said before, what do you want to do? You want everyone to turn their attention in your direction. That's the objective when you're making a speech act, right? If you don't have that, then what's your objective is to keep the thread going. You want to say, oh, that's an interesting point, Bonnie. What do you think about this? Or, how about, I know you said this, but have you thought about it this way? You want to sort of build on what's already been said and sort of keep the conversation going. So it creates a very different dynamic. So they had that space of this closed server, and it served them well because they were able to work out things like, I was fascinated to see, they spent a lot of time on what they called optics. This is, how does the world see us? And it was like, just thousands of these chats about like swastikas. Should we have swastikas? Yes, I know we all love swastikas, but maybe we should put them aside for this, or what color pants should we wear? Or what color shirt should we wear? What should be the insignias on our, it was this sociologically, it was a fascinating way of sort of understanding how these various groups of people who understand that their ideas are abhorrent to most Americans are trying to kind of come together in a way that will, be the most palatable version of their political ideology to, what they have this notion of opening the Overton window, opening what's possible, what people are willing to accept. But to do that, you have to be respectable, you have to be acceptable. And they need a place to work that out. That's not going to happen on social media. On social media, they're just going to try to prove who can have the biggest swastika, who can be purer than everybody else. Here, they can be strategic, they can be tactical. So when you ask me to contrast these two examples, and I'm sorry that I've gone on so long on it, but it is the crux of what I'm saying in that second half of the book, which is, the medium that a group uses really helps define the limits of what it's able to do as a group. And so of course, I found disgusting what they were doing, what they were talking about in these white supremacist chat rooms. But I also had many times that kind of ironic thought that, Isn't it unfortunate that this is a tool that they've figured out how to use?
How did they do this?
Right, but why aren't there groups of climate activists or Black Lives Matter activists utilizing the same sort of spaces to develop their ideas before they sort of jump out into the great crazy chaotic social media?
Okay, good. Because in the next question, it's very good because your answers are kind of tied into my next question, which is good. The chapter about the virus is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Eva Lee's personal story intertwined with COVID-19 is riveting.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the Red Dawn chain of doctors? You point out that everything they tried to do was undermined by the federal government. Where were their suggestions eventually implemented? Please tell us more about their fight to be heard.
Yeah. So Red Dawn was this was an email chain. It was an email chain that included a lot of local public health officials, and the people who were on this this chain, they came to call themselves Red Dawn because, in reference to it, there was a 1980s movie about a group of high school students that it's an imagined like Russian invasion of the United States, and a group of high school students fight them off. And this movie was called Red Dawn. And so they saw themselves, this group of doctors and public health officials saw themselves in sort of like insurgent role, dissident role, almost you could, I mean, they used the word dissident multiple times with me because they felt that, they saw the pandemic sort of coming, like before we actually felt it. I'm talking, early January 2020, when things were starting to sort of emerge in China. And some of them were epidemiologists and people who had studied the way viruses spread. And they went to sort of code red, like right away. And they quickly understood that like nobody wanted to hear that in the government. Because there was an effort to say everything's fine, it's going to go away. I mean, we all remember this, right? From those early days. And it was hard even to get sort of concrete information about what this meant at the same time that what the pandemic would mean, at the same time that there actually was, a lot of sort of historical data for the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, and a good amount of knowledge about how pandemics spread. They didn't know everything about it. COVID in the beginning there was a lot of qualities that we didn't really understand, but they really wanted to apply scientific process to figuring it out, and they felt shut down. And so this Red Dawn group, this email chain, became their sort of refuge. It became the place where they could talk to each other as scientists without worrying about politics.
And they were doing all the right things by having their ideas in small groups and incubating these ideas.
Yes.
And then they weren't allowed.
Yes. Well, in this case, like they hoped that their ideas would sort of trickle up to, or percolate up rather to, people in power who could implement them. Like they wanted long before we started wearing masks or social distancing, like these were the things they were talking about long before, weeks before, which would have made a big difference in terms of the pandemic. But you asked sort of how their ideas actually did make it out. So they continued to have this group, even when they began to feel that, nobody was listening to them. And it did have its effect because, if you remember in those early days, it was just very hard to get concrete, practical advice even about how to prevent the virus from spreading. And they were working those things out at a very granular level. They were saying, okay, if we're going to keep restaurants open, how many people can sit at a table? Do we need to wear gloves? Like, these very like specific things, that, and a lot of the public health officials who were on those email chains then were able to, who were hungry, looking to the federal government for some kind of concrete information, but not finding it there, were finding it on Red Dawn. And they could then take that and go back and implement them at local level. Because what happened in those, first few months, first half a year, even before there was a kind of coherent federal policy, is it was really just every locality had its own rules. There were sort of general guidelines from the CDC. Even those were being sort of undermined by the executive branch, because they didn't want it to seem like things were too scary. And people from the CDC later said that they weren't allowed to put out certain information. And politics was just sort of winning out, over science. And here, Red Dawn was this place that was incubating a sort of pure scientific relationship to the pandemic and trying to actually figure out, what do we know about it? What do we not know? How far can we go in making, prescriptions, and so in that sense, it was a very sort of useful space, but also a very, as an example in the book, it's a funny fit with all these social movements. And also just because there was a great deal of frustration, among those people that they weren't being heard. But the chapter kind of ends with a former CDC official saying, thank God they were there, and thank God they continued to do it, because they provided the sort of seed for what would later become prescriptions that actually could make a difference with the pandemic.
Thank God there was someone like Dr. Eva Lee, who, a little strange in her personality, as you tell this wonderful story, she didn't let up. She pushed. She was incredible. She and the others.
That's right.
But of course, the government was fighting them and would not let them get their information out in a timely enough manner. The Black Lives Matter movement gained incredible momentum nationally and internationally as a rallying cry against racism and police brutality after the killing of George Floyd. With such an outpouring of support, why did the movement seem to peter out?
I think it's the same sort of dynamic as the Tahrir Square example in some ways, although with an important difference, which I can talk about, which is I think that the activists in Black Lives Matter have learned from these moments of extreme visibility and sort of attention that they get, that they need to build off of those in a different sort of way. I think Black Lives Matter was born it was literally born on social media. It was born as a hashtag, and what do you want? You want a hashtag, you want a hashtag to spread, you want a hashtag to go viral. And so when that becomes your impulse, when that becomes the sort of core of what a movement is, let's grab attention, let's do whatever we, and at some point it became these videos that would periodically appear of some horribly violent instance of police brutality, that would spike the movement. Suddenly there'd be a lot of attention on this issue. The hashtag would go viral, and then people would, 10 days later, people would sort of begin to forget about it, would go down, and then, another video would come up, and then people would, and so the movement became sort of attached to this need for very visible, highly dramatic, emotionally charged moments. And that's a problem. And it's not just, I'm not the one who's saying this. The second part of the book is a lot of reporting, talking with people who are at the front lines of these movements. It's a problem because if all, for the reason that Saul Alinsky said it was a problem, right? To have just that third act, when you have these moments that in their best case, they allow a conversation or a new vocabulary to begin to enter into the American, in the American sort of bloodstream, and I think that did happen in 2020. We were all talking about institutional racism and in new and different ways. But the objectives of these activists are more than just having a slightly changed conversation for a month. They if you really talk about what they want, the real organizers on the ground, they want to change police reform. They want to change, the way bail works in the country. They want to, open up parts of society that they feel are closed to people of color. There are very concrete law-based, statute-based things that they want to get changed. Most of them are very local, at a very local level. So if you take the issue of police reform, there's a whole plethora of ideas about how to shift more money from police departments, where they get money sort of unquestionably, in their budget, to social services, so that maybe it's a social worker that shows up in certain instances when somebody's acting erratically on the street, and not always a police officer with a gun. So that's a fairly sort of moderate idea, but all of that whole mix of sort of solutions that would need change on local level, that would need city councils to vote on things. All of that is very different from the work from the virality of those moments, and in some ways the virality of those moments, even though there's a lot of energy in them, and there's a lot of energy that can be then used and translated into making these sorts of concrete changes, they can also be a distraction. They can also be, if you don't know how to use them wisely, they can be overwhelming, which is what these activists said to me. They said, I looked at one group in Florida called the Dream Defenders, and they actually did what they called a blackout. They went offline, deleted their apps on their phones for 3 or 4 months, because they said, we need to do a different sort of work. Like, we're so distracted by needing, gaining followers, on Twitter or Facebook, or thinking that what we're seeing there is what we should be striving for. And so they decided to get rid of social media for their group for a few months. And they started going door to door and having conversations with people, conversations in the way, in the 1830s, when people would have to go and get that petition signed, they'd have conversations. And what did they find when they had those conversations? Is most of these activists believe in abolishing the police and getting rid of the police. The people in the communities that they were representing said, no, we don't want to get rid of the police. Like, what are you talking about? And then they would start to talk to them, and they would say, well, we're not happy with the way the police acts in our communities. Look, don't get us wrong, but we don't want to get rid of the police. So that's a much more sort of nuanced perspective that demands a conversation, demands a set of solutions that are not as easy as just coming up with a 3-word slogan that you can throw up on Twitter, and it opened up for them a whole new realm of activism that was on the ground, that was about changing the local reality and the local rules in a way that could actually be concrete and not just attached to, when is the next moment going to arrive when we're going to all go to the streets for a few days and then go back home.
It's all fascinating, Gal, because you are now reliving I am reliving through you what I have read in the book, and it's very exciting to hear you express it yourself. Soon we're going to have to go to the chat and the questions. So I did want to talk a little bit about the chapters, the names of your chapters, because I found them very, very interesting, how the layout of the chapters and the various names and why you chose the names that you did. But we will, since you talked about that a little bit, we'll go to a final question. And so we've been talking about and comparing pre-digital and digital forms of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we return to the quiet before, the name of your book, when Twitter and Facebook, with their captivating, explosive stimuli, are easily accessible for a quick rush?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make sure that future revolutionary ideas do not disappear as fast as they come into existence?
Yeah, that's the question.
That's
that's the question. And I have to say that I am, over the course of talking about the book to people and sort of having it be in the world the last few months, that I've had a lot of great conversations with young people, young activists, and I feel that they give me hope. And that I think they do something that I hope people get out of this book, which is they act with self-awareness about the medium that they're using. They understand that Twitter and Facebook and certain kinds of large platforms, social media, are good for certain things, and they're not good for other things. So the Black Lives Matter activists that I got to know, for example, they understand that Twitter is not where you sort of figure out who you are as a group. They have their little closed WhatsApp group, a little chat encrypted app group where it's just 10 or 15 people that have sort of earned their trust. And they have very focused conversations about the issues that involve their group and what they were trying to achieve and what the strategies are. So they've kind of intuited that there is a need for these two different modes of communicating. And to me, that's very hopeful, because I think in other parts of our sort of digital lives, we've kind of understood this, like we've even in the course of working on this book, I think we're much less naive about the ways that the communication that we use affects the way we think and the sorts of communication that we can have. We know that like a friendship on Twitter or Facebook is not a true friendship, right? If we were confused about that 15 years ago, we're not confused about it now. We understand the ways that democracy gets very gets undermined in many ways by social media's sort of pushing everything to the extremes and making everybody sort of yell at each other all the time and become hardened in their position, that's not good for democratic institution, right? Like that's something I think we've come to understand in a big way over the last 3 or 4 years. I feel like this idea of like how social movements or how change happens, I think we're still a little bit stuck on the sort of romance of if a hashtag can just go viral, if enough people just click on this 3-word slogan, then we can change the world. I think there is still that thinking, and that's what I'm trying to challenge here a little bit. But I'm trying to challenge it in a way where I'm just pointing to other things in our lives where we understand these distinctions. So at the end of the day, like the takeaway that I hope people have from this book is actually a fairly simple one, which is just, these are all tools. These are all tools that we use, and we shouldn't confuse them and think that, in the sense that like, were their tools and we are the ones that pick them up. We are the ones that make a decision to use one tool and not another. And different tools have different functions. So we need to think carefully if our objective is to, make change on anything, is to build a sustainable movement that's going to actually make a difference, that we actually are using the tools that are going to help us do that.
Amen. Gal, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Conversation with you. And I think that we will give it over to Ron now with the questions on the chat. Ron?
Yes. And actually, I have one question I'd like to ask to start
Sure.
with. And that is, how do you fit January the 6th in with this?
Yeah. It's funny, people have asked me that, and I've thought a lot about it. I mean, I do think, and my hesitation is only because I haven't spent a lot of time looking at, I spent a lot of time looking at what happened. I haven't spent a lot of time understanding, in the way I did, say, Charlottesville, what was the buildup. But I understand, even from cursory look at the reporting, that this sort of incubation that I talk about in the book very much took place with regards to January 6th. That there was, for weeks and months, there were people sort of building up to this idea. It didn't just spontaneously happen, and it came out of these sort of closed worlds where people came to believe that the reality that we were all experiencing was not the reality as it should be, which was that Donald Trump should win. And I mean, it's almost the most extreme sort of case I can imagine of that kind of echo chamber, which is like the bad version of what I'm describing. If I'm talking about having a secluded space where you can work out ideas, the bad version of that is a secluded space where you can't hear anything that comes from the outside. So people could be telling you the truth, and they're telling you that reality, that something is black, but you decide that it's white. I mean, what obviously exacerbated that situation enormously is that you had the president of the United States sort of saying that they were right to believe what they believed. So, so I think that very much these dynamics were in play there. And in the way that Charlottesville, which is an example I know a little bit better, that, after that explosive moment, they were what's called, those white supremacists were what's called deplatformed. They had to go into deeper and deeper holes to even exist online. They were shoved off of every platform, and so they lost their space. They lost their space to sort of keep building this idea that they had. I think a similar thing happened after January 6th. That I mean, maybe somewhere in the depths of the dark web, like they're trying to coordinate and share ideas and foster this notion that they still have. About the election, but they have to go deeper and deeper in order to do that.
Yeah.
One of the questions that also comes up is for movements like this, usually the youthful energy is critical,
Mm-hmm.
and but with the difference in the last few decades. Now, with the cases of Charlottesville, Black Lives Matter, and so on, the youthful energy has the added dimensions of social media.
Mm.
And how has that changed the dynamic? How is it from what it was in movements in the 1800s or 1900s even? Civil rights movement, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good way of framing the question, I think, and in some ways I haven't really thought about this so much, but it's true that the youthfulness adds a sort of accelerant in some ways, because they're so molded by the need to grab attention that social media sort of instills and sort of pushes you towards. And I'd say, the thing that is unfortunate that we've lost in that process is that you can see in the civil rights movement and in things like Chartism, is that there is so much hard work, actual, sweat work to make these movements happen. I mean, if you think about, what it meant to put on a rally in the 1960s, even, you would have to mimeograph the flyers and get them out into the streets and go door to door. And, we sort of discount the importance of that work because it feels sort of brainless, and it's just it's like the grunt work that one has to do. But actually, there's a great sociologist named Zeynep Tufekci who wrote contemporary sociologist who wrote a book called From Twitter to Tear Gas, and this is her big idea, which I very much sort of incorporated into my book. And she talks about the need for any movement to build up, and this, I'll get a little academies here, but I know I can with the two of you, to build up its internalities, its strengths internally, and you do that through that hard work, through that, sort of day after day, knocking on doors, getting that petition signed, and that work involved actually solidifies people's solidarity to the movement. It gives people time, right, which is critical. It gives people time to begin to develop their ideas, because when things happen fast, they're usually very emotional. But if things happen slow, there's time to cool down and sort of think a lot more strategically. So all of that is really important. And she argues that because social media allows you to go like from 0 to 60, when you want to have let's say that a mass protest is your objective, it allows you to go from 0 to 60. You'd skip over all those things, just like the Saul Alinsky idea. You skip over all those steps, and those are important steps. And so I think part of what makes me worry about the young people today is that it's I think older generations before the internet didn't have to integrate those those stages of a movement into what they did. They were just part of the reality. You couldn't make it happen unless you put the work in, you know? And now
Yeah.
because you can skip over those things, I think that people do, and it's illusory because you feel like just because everyone is sharing your tweet with your hashtag that it actually is changing minds, when really what changes minds is that long, difficult process of pulling sort of a new reality into being.
You know, Gal, you talk about the grunt work
Yeah.
involved. And, you know, there have been primaries throughout the country recently. In Santa Fe, in New Mexico, we had primaries 10 days ago. And there was a sentence that appeared in the Santa Fe New Mexican on June 5th.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about a politician, somebody running for local politics. And the sentence went like this: it was old school retail politics at its finest. And for all the nouveau methods would-be office holders have to communicate with voters, walking a neighborhood remains a staple.
Yeah.
And that's what this guy was doing. He was walking his neighborhood, he was shaking hands, he was talking to people, and this is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's true. And sometimes I feel when I'm talking about the book that I'm actually saying something that's quite obvious, you know, but it's also something that we weirdly have sort of forgotten as time has moved forward so quickly, you know, in our means, again, the means of communication have changed so much, because it's not just, you know, I bet that most of the people even who are on this, you know, talk tonight are not on Twitter or Facebook, or maybe they're on Facebook, maybe they're not on Twitter, but it's not the actual use of the social media. It's the way that the metabolism of social media, the way that people interact, the ways that it gets you to think and perform, the way that has sort of leaked out into the culture at large. It's affected our politics. I mean, you know, you could see Donald Trump as very much sort of a creature of social media, you know, somebody who made himself on a platform like Twitter, who understands intuitively sort of what a Twitter wants, right? So it's those qualities that I'm, you know, I mean, I in my thinking, I go back to, and you guys will know these names, but the sort of mid-century media theorists like Marshall McLuhan, you know, who really, this was the big thought, you know, it's the medium is the message. We all know that like saying, but it actually is a very essential thing that we've kind of forgotten in some ways, that the form of communication that you use is a kind of container that certain things can sit inside and certain things just won't fit in there, you know. So I worry that kind of like slow, deliberative form of communication that is so important for democracy, for building movements, it doesn't fit in that container, you know. And so we need to just be aware that container is the main one that we're holding these days, that it's affecting everything, and that we better come up with other spaces, other tables to sit around, you know, where we can talk to each other.
Yes. Yes.
Don Goldstein has a question that relates to something you said just a couple of minutes back. And it's about the thing of, especially today, as movements move from one stage to another. You mentioned the 3 stages as starting the talk. And so his question really is, how do people know today when it's moving from one stage to another? Does it happen naturally? Are people actually making decisions?
Right.
What are the problems? People get bogged down in the process, and like in some cases where they literally don't move on to the next stage.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. And you know, I don't want to suggest that, you know, the end point is some kind of debating society where people, you know, kind of are just talking and not actually moving to the stage of action. I think in every circumstance, it's probably going to be different in terms of what kind of time frame is needed and what kind of consensus has to be reached for people to move from a place of sharing ideas, working things out, and actually manifesting them in the world. So I would be loath to sort of give a formula, you know, but in a way, but that's not really like the focus of my book is to look at that very earliest stage with a sense that because I feel like that's the part that we've sort of lost. I feel people understand in some ways intuitively that when a critical mass builds, sort of what to do with that. But yeah, I wish I had a kind of a more satisfying answer. I think more importantly is the notion that you need to have both. You need to have both, be able to work in both modes concurrently, that maybe it's not you move from one stage to another, but that you always have a space where you can keep refining things and keep sharing ideas at the same time that you're conscious of the need to go viral, the need to share, make whatever ideas you're developing sort of make their way into the world.
One of the follow-up questions that he has is, given the social media environment, can movements develop without formal leaders as such? And I think what he's referring to perhaps is the civil rights movement had Dr. Martin Luther King, which was such a moving figure.
Right.
Are these central figures critical to movements with social media?
I actually think they are. I think it's not a popular thing to say, but I believe that there is a kind of distillation process that happens when you have representatives. Let's say representatives, not leaders, because leaders is, I think, in movement world, in activist circles, has come to mean somebody who's sort of usurping power in some way. But if you think about it more, that I think every natural structure eventually coalesces around certain people. It's just a natural inclination that we all have as human beings. The anthropologist can tell us if I'm right about this, but we I'm speaking very generally and kind of stupidly about this, but it seems to me like we always sort of want to sort of have certain people that kind of speak for the group. And I think what happens on Twitter is that we have this illusion that, here's this very democratic medium where everybody is able to speak. And at some level that's true. We all have the bullhorn, but because Twitter privileges or has a bias towards certain types of speech, certain people end up becoming the kings and queens of Twitter. It just happens. And the way they get there is not through accountability or earning their spot. It's because they just have figured out how to speak on the medium in a good way. And the little example just that will kind of capture this is at the height of the kind of earlier moment in Black Lives Matter in 2015, 16, a lot of activists told me there were magazines that would print the most effective activists, Black Lives Matter activists in the country, and they would use Twitter follower counts to determine who those people were. And then those people were then invited to the White House. They became the spokespeople for Black Lives Matter, the de facto leaders. But they were there only because they had really figured out Twitter, not because they were on the streets, not because they had earned it in any kind of real way. And so I think, you can't, a vacuum of any leadership is not sort of a reasonable thing to presume can actually exist. It's more a question of sort of how do you pick who represents the ideas.
Diane Schmidt asks, it's a question comment. The power of Sean Hannity seems to have knit an amorphous group of like-minded people to feel that they belong to a community.
Yeah.
And then it goes on from there, getting into some other issues. But I don't know. Would you like to comment on that?
I don't want to go too deep into Sean Hannity, but I think he understands, he's gotten it as sort of an emotional truth, which is a sense of anxiety or a sense of resentment, a politics of resentment, that the world is somehow getting away from us, and he's tapped into that. And yes, I think you can create a community around that feeling. What does that community want? I don't know, or I shudder to really take that thought to its final conclusion. But there is definitely, I think, a sense of attachment and community when something that you feel is reinforced in that same way, and you have a sense that there are other people who feel similarly.
Yeah. So one last question. Gloria Avella Balin asked the broader question that can we really, I mean, in the long run, is social media really detrimental to social movements?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that somebody asked this, because I know that I'm sort of coming down hard on social media, and I want to go back to this idea that social media is one tool in the toolbox, and it's an incredible tool. I mean, like, when in the history of the world have people been able, I can get off, with all of you right now, go on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and send a message out, send a press release message about my state of mind to, however many people will pick it up and keep passing it along. That's an incredible thing. And it's an incredible tool for ideas, for new ideas, new narratives to sort of emerge. But it's not the only tool, and it's an incredibly seductive tool, because, like, I think it does tap into something deep in our human natures in terms of just the desire to get attention, and it sort of feeds that. And I think it can be incredibly distracting, but used properly, used as a tool among tools, and understood for its purpose, for what purpose it can serve, I think it can be incredibly important for a movement. It just needs to be understood for what it is.
I would like we've been talking the entire time about the quiet before, and I see Bonnie has her copy there also. Good. So and oh, there we go. Okay, maybe we can all get them.
It's
up
not a
at the
big
same
deal that
time.
I'm holding my own book up.
So there are 10 episodes, not case studies, stories, historical events that you have developed in a fascinating way here. And this, I think, is very important for us today in the environment that we're living in, to read and be aware of what this means for us in our current environment. And I would like to personally recommend this, and I think people,
yes,
and people who are interested in this subject and are concerned about issues today will find this a telling and a fascinating read. Just one last question, which I'll even comment on. Rick Vitale asked about, these stories are from the modern period, essentially. And he asked, is there anything from the ancient world that'd be relevant?
I went down various paths, like in trying to assemble these chapters. That was probably the hardest part of this book, was just finding the right stories that I wanted to tell. And it's true that the first one is in the 1630s, involves the scientific revolution. I started around there, I think, even in my thinking, because literacy also gets to a certain point where I can imagine looking at a medium where people are actually communicating in this way. But there are, I have definitely looked at examples that are even older, graffiti on walls in Rome, like things like that, where it's clear that there were ways that people could incubate radical ideas even back then.
Gal, thank you very much for being with us on the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today.
Pleasure.
Bonnie, thank you for your insightful conversation and questions. And
thank you for this wonderful book that I was able to read and enjoy tremendously. The stories are great.
Thank you.
The ideas are important, and the stories around these ideas are wonderful. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I love it was wonderful questions.
Thank you.
And we would love to see you in Santa Fe.
Yes, next year in Santa Fe.
Next year in Santa Fe, yes. Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.